Good. Welcome everyone to another edition of the Grounded Theory Seminar run by the Anglo-Ruskin Grounded Theory Group in collaboration with the Grounded Theorist. Today's seminar is focusing on the getting started with grounded theory. We've taken a slightly different approach for this particular one, in that we set you some homework to do before today. So hopefully everyone has had a chance to look at the pre-video, which was a discussion on foundations of grounded theory between Dr. Hilary Engwood and our guest for today, Dr. Oliver Thompson. Before I continue and introduce Oliver, a few ground rules for today. First and foremost, this session is being recorded, and the recording will be made available to the other PGRs and researchers across the world via our YouTube channel. So if you are not happy being recorded, etc., please keep that in mind and keep your camera off. The chat is open, and all questions are welcome during through the chat. We are monitoring that, but we'd very much appreciate it if people are happy to just chat to us, because it's always very nice. We are a friendly group. We don't have a preference for a particular flavor of grounded theory. Everyone is welcome, as long as you are a grounded theorist or a grounded theorist in the making. So for those new to our merry group of grounded theorists, my name's Nikki. I'm at Anglo-Ruskin, and the other members of our group are Maria, who is our collaborator from the Grounded Theory Network and the Grounded Theorist. We have Janet in the background today. We have Pippa, who is also Anglo-Ruskin, together with Janet and myself, and I'm not sure if Kat's here already or not. Between the five of us, we manage most of this group, together with Dr. Hilary Engwood, who can't join us today because she is working in Canada at the moment. Academic work. No, she is actually on annual leave this week and working next week, but she can't be with us today. So I think that's ground rules and introduction bit. Before we get started, because we're the theme for today is getting started with grounded theory, we have a few questions for you to answer through Mentimeter, which hopefully Maria has got ready up and going for you to interact with. We like doing every once in a while some interactive things. So Maria, if you would.
Yeah, okay, so thanks to everyone who's watched the video and submitted questions ahead of time. But we thought it would be really useful to also get a sense of the people who are in the room today and your priorities. So I've just popped a link in the chat there, and we're inviting you to have a look at or submit your questions or your perspectives around why you come to the session today. I'll just see if I can share my screen with you. Hopefully that is working. For some reason, I am not able to see the page. One moment. Anyone know how I can see my menus? Here we go. Sharing the screen again. Yeah, so we're interested in seeing your reasons for coming today, in getting started to do grounded theory. What did you want to find out? Someone wants to find out about Oliver, so not quite sure how to respond to that.
That's not an answer.
Might be the reason they came, I guess.
My mum, I think she's here.
Yeah. So this is fun. So I guess it's a bit of a compound question really there. We've got, why are you coming today and what did you want to find out? So we want to come because of Oliver, but what we want to find out is everything. So that, you know, just a small remit for you today, Oliver, and something about coding potentially, as well as learning about the basics of theory development, theory building. And just reassuring themselves that they're on the right track as far as grounded theory goes. I think it's a very powerful methodology, but sometimes it can be quite daunting because you don't necessarily have that descriptive formula for how to learn about how to do it. Okay, so we've still got some people coming through, but I think what we're getting primarily there is everything, coding and basics. So I think if we start with the basics and see how we progress from that.
Very good. I think that brings us nicely to the alignment with today's session, is that we're looking at the beginnings of grounded theory. Now, to help us through figuring this all out, we have our guest today, Dr. Oliver Thompson. Oliver is an associate professor at the University College of Osteopathy in London. He is also the host of the amazing podcast, Worst Matter podcast, which, if you haven't listened to it yet, it's definitely worthwhile listening to, particularly the series on qualitative research, with, in particular, for the people in this group. There is an episode on grounded theory, and from experience, that episode gave me some ammunition for my Viva not too long ago, which was very helpful. So if you haven't listened to it just yet, go listen, find it. It's on all the big socially things. Oliver is a friend of our group. He's featured before in an episode, and I was going to say a very big thank you, Oliver, for joining us again. It's always helpful that we have someone here with a very broad understanding of qualitative research who can also situate grounded theory in the bigger picture. And I think, just for those who've not had a chance to watch the video, just to get the ball rolling, could you briefly summarize the philosophical foundations of grounded theory as you talked about them with Hilary, and then we can hang all the other questions off of that.
Thanks, Nicky. That sounds like one of those great opening Viva questions that every PhD student looks forward to. Just summarize the underpinning theory. I think first just say thank you to Nicky, Hilary and Maria for the invitation. I'm sure I've been invited too many times to this group, but I'm delighted that I've got a home. I was a member of the University of Brighton Research GT group, which I think is kind of dissolved. I could be wrong, but the staff that were leading it are kind of retired or moved on. So I'm pleased to find a group such as this where I can continue my interest in grounded theory. I think, and just a few caveats. I guess I'm an expert in my experience of using GT. I'm by no means an expert in GT. And so your question, to briefly summarize the underpinning philosophical principles under GT. I mean, I think for me, and I think Hilary and I, we spoke about, I suppose, the influence of the two originators, whether it's symbolic interactionism and kind of recognizing that meaning is placed or created by the interaction of people. And depending on your flavor, if you're kind of going to adopt a more constructivist view, then that kind of carries through, that you're looking to develop theory or grow theory rather than find it. And I suppose it's this deep interest in social interaction and social process. So I get, without kind of rehashing the underpinning theory, which I wouldn't do particularly eloquently, I think it's some key principles which at least inform one's use of GT. If you're interested in the kind of social world, social processes, how people make sense of things, then GT seems like it's a pretty useful methodology to adopt.
Well, thank you for that, and I think you're there, and the sense making is a big part of it, isn't it? And it's what I like about grounded theory is that it's something that particularly focuses on active things, doing stuff, process based, which is kind of, I think, where it sets it apart a little bit from some of the other methodology.
Yeah. And which is probably why it's so popular in the kind of health professions or education, where you do kind of conceptualize many of the problems as being social processes or psychosocial processes, and so it lends itself to that.
Yeah. I'd like to open the session to questions from the audience. I appreciate that the first one is always very awkward. So I'm going to throw in a bit of a curveball, and I think you may have touched on this in your episode with Professors Burks and Mills. It's also one that Barney Glaser quite regularly has addressed in some of his seminars. And it was one where I think I've been very lucky. So what is your view on a particular question is, do I need a supervisor that knows grounded theory in order to do grounded theory?
I think, I mean, my personal view is that it probably helps. Just like if you're going to do any other set of techniques or methods, I think that it's purely from a kind of intellectual pastoral point of view, it's going to support you. I think embarking on a methodology which your supervisors aren't necessarily experienced or skilled in just makes it harder for you as a doctoral student. I mean, I think part of doctoral work is kind of mentorship, isn't it? It's kind of learning on the job and learning from your supervisors. Not to say they've got nothing else to teach you, but it would seem to me that you could mentee them if they were able to kind of support you with that methodology. So I'm almost certain that people have done very well doing doctorates without supervisors, with supervisors who aren't experienced in GT. But my sense is that it would be advisable to have someone that has some of that deep knowledge in the methodology. Certainly for me, in my experience with my PhD, I had one supervisor who was less experienced with GT, and a second that was much more experienced, and that just worked really well. And that worked really, that balance worked really well for me. One was a clinician, well, actually both were clinicians, but one was a grounded theorist.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think I've been very lucky in Hilary, who's obviously got a strong background in grounded theory, but also is these kind of peer groups help for those people who are, I think, what was Glaser's term for it, minus mentees or minus mentor. He had a particular word for it I didn't particularly like because it sounds very negative, but peer support is a big thing, but you're right, it does help. Questions from the audience, please. Does anyone have any burning or any of the other people with us today? There are plenty of you, so don't be shy. We don't bite. No. Here we go. As someone who had two supervisors without grounded theory knowledge, I would strongly advocate having a supervisor who does. And I think Maria has had that experience that it's very helpful to have a supervisor who knows grounded theory. It probably gives you a smoother start, would you say, Maria?
Yeah, for me, it was, as well as learning about being a PhD student and learning about grounded theory, it was also about educating my supervisors. So it was kind of like a different direction to kind of like the education experience that perhaps I'd anticipated. But what it did give me was experience of talking about my research approach at an early stage, because we were able to map it onto different approaches. So it has swings and roundabouts, but I think if I did it again, I would perhaps look for someone who had methodological experience for any new project.
I suppose the challenge there is that sometimes when you embark on a PhD, you're not really sure what your methodology is going to be. So you select supervisors that might have interest in other aspects of the PhD, but not necessarily your methodology. And so then you're left with a gap, and maybe there isn't an opportunity to take on a third supervisor or someone with those specialist skills. But I think those initial months, if not years, of being a PhD student can be so daunting and so confusing, and you're having to learn, to work incredibly autonomously as well as learning new skills. It would just seem to me to be useful to have someone that already has acquired those skills and is also skilled at supporting students through that methodology. So it's that I think that'd be the ideal. I think if you could have someone that has some experience in GT.
Is there anyone in the audience who has who has supervisors who are not familiar with grounded theory? We saw some hands, but I've lost my view thingy. I don't know how to drive Zoom. Where are we? I saw a hand, I think.
Rebecca's got a hand up.
Yes. I
have. Hello. I'm a EdD student at Brighton University, and neither of my supervisors have got grounded theory expertise. That wholly supportive and coming with me on the journey. But what I'm grappling with at the moment, and you're all going to laugh, is about where to put the literature review, because I have been working kind of iteratively, and in my pilot project use the literature review as I went along as part of my data. So now coming into stage 2, it's kind of making the case with my research plan for doing that again, because obviously in stage 1 I was encouraged to traditional literature review. It needs to come at this point in your write-up, it needs to be like this, but I found that quite restrictive, and actually I felt it made my writing more confusing because I presented literature that I didn't actually find out until much later on in the research, because I didn't know where the research was going to go. So I didn't know what I was going to need to do the literature research about until I'd collected the data. So it's a bit it's a bit of a tangle at the moment, and I don't really feel a clear path.
I think that's a good point. Oliver, it's kind of 2 things there. One, what's the place of the literature review, I guess, in the thesis, but probably more broadly, where does literature sit in the wider grounded theory process? Because I'm not sure it's that rigorous, but I see where the question comes from.
Yeah, I think there's two points there. One is that I think this idea that you can just kind of suspend all kind of cognition and previous knowledge is just untenable and not possible, right? So I think once you accept that you're filled with knowledge, even at the point of starting your PhD, even without even looking at the literature, you're just filled with stuff which can potentially be forced onto the data, then engaging in the literature review is no worse or difficult or problematic. So I think that's the first thing, to acknowledge that that not only is it seems like it's cognitively impossible not to incorporate a priori knowledge literature in your grounded theory development, but also we're bound by, as you said, your own kind of processes at your university, and ethics applications and grants and proposals. Although, I mean, I just think that we have to be pragmatic, that you cannot escape some of these kind of procedures. And so I don't think it's not a problem in terms of you just being reflexive and just knowing where some of that data, or that literature rather, fed into your analysis, and just being explicit and acknowledging that and memoing it and knowing how it shaped it or not. And so I really don't see engaging in literature as being any different to being a clinician, for example, or an educator working in your field and bringing that to the research question or the research topic. It's just stuff floating around one's head. Some of it's called literature, some of it's called experience. So I'm not sure that helps. So it certainly wouldn't worry. And there's a way of writing. There's a route out of this maze about what do I do with the literature review that I did a lot of, and some of it's relevant, some of it's not.
Yeah, and I think, just Rebecca, from the AD perspective, because I was on one of those, so I've had 2 literature reviews. I did an initial one, which was a really broad overview of a wider topic, and then the second one was, after everything was done, I went back to the literature and did a very specific literature review on what I actually found out. Now, lucky for me, those 2 were kind of connected.
And where did you present that? My question is, I mean, if you had your first very general one, did you have that in the kind of traditional contextualizing and situating the research field, and then the second one later, or did you put the second one just after the first one, even though you hadn't kind of done it in that order?
No, so my first one was, the requirement for the doctoral program was to do a literature review at the start of the doctoral program, but I intentionally kept that one fairly broad, with agreement from the team that was working with me. And then I had, I think, literature review, methodology, methods, findings, and then I had another literature review. So I just spaced them apart really nicely.
Yeah, I think that's where I'm going with it, because that kind of makes sense. Also, in terms of unraveling the thinking as the thinking is happening, it's kind of it's becoming more of the lived experience and in real time.
Maxine,
sorry.
Yes, go.
I was just going to say, just on that note, something which was helpful for me was to kind of just plot, dare I say, a graph, but not a graph, but with 2 axes and your kind of various kind of points in time, and just where literature came in and what that coincided with, whether there are kind of formal things you have to do, various submissions, but also certain points of analyses. And again, you can just track that. I mean, all of this is about being transparent about where this stuff came in and how it influenced your data conception and data analysis. And what's happened has happened. So I think you've got to document that. I think in terms of the final thesis, clearly it doesn't, you don't want to at least give the impression that you front loaded and dumped everything you know about everything in those early chapters. And then there's no kind of surprise at the end for the reader. It needs to tell a story, and I think it needs to show kind of theoretical growth, that as you move through the thesis, more and more literature is brought in.
Yeah. Maxine, you have a hand.
Yes, I've got 2 points. No, I had a psychologist and a nutritionist supervising my grounded theory, and actually my first supervisor was brilliant. She really engaged with me, and I felt she didn't make assumptions of, oh, well, I know this one, but I don't know that one, so I'm going to be biased towards this one. So it meant it was much more open, and I could engage and decide which sort of grounded theory. I went with constructivist grounded theory in the end. But it also made me really stop and look at them well, which is why on Twitter this morning I put, oh my God, reading, Glazer's 1967 little booklet. I thought, oh, it's only little, dry as bones, and I only really appreciated it further down the line when I'd done much, much more reading and went back to it. You got more out of it.
Yeah.
I did a topic area that had never been researched across the world before. So, Rebecca, I think in response to you, I did a scoping review to justify why I was also doing grounded theory, which I used asking O'Malley, and it was like, nil found, not able to do this stage, not able to do that stage. And again, it gave greater credit to why I chose grounded theory. But I remember being in a workshop that Kathy Sharmas did a few years ago at Lancaster, and this was brought up, and she said, different universities have different requirements. If you have to fit the bill and hoop jump, you don't say how high, you just say, yes, will do. And you do something so broad and almost meaningless that it fits their criteria that you must have a literature review in. But she said, traditionally, you don't engage with the literature until you are seeking to discuss your findings in more depth. And therefore, that fits the bill. She said, so you have to do what's right for your institution. And it's not prostituting yourself as a researcher. It's actually making sure you hoop jump, because often, she said, and particularly, she quoted America, where she's from. She said, they won't give you a go ahead to do it unless you play the ball. So she said, you've got to learn how to play the ball and not start to really influence your thinking too much, but you're keeping everybody happy. And that's the sort of the difficulty. She said, that's the dilemma you face. And Nicky talked about the fact he did a very generalized one, and that's the way around it. If your program requirements are such, you just go with the flow. But it was, for me, it was a piece of cake. There was no published research on what I did. So it was easy. I could justify putting a scoping review in. It also strengthened my case for why I was doing grounded theory. So there is no one absolute way forward. And I think that's what is a bit discomforting as a newbie to grounded theory. You want to get it so right. And I remember tackling her on some of the coding issues. And she just went, well, of course. I said, this. I said, but it's not written like that in your book. And she went, oh, okay. note to self for a further future edition. But again, sometimes engaging in discussion just is a revelation.
Thank you so much for that contribution. I think the literature reviews are a real challenge for most grounded theorists. We did have a number of other questions submitted prior to today. Nikki, have you got any to hand there?
Yeah, I'm just catching up through the review, just to the chat to make sure I'm not missing anything. They're all focusing on the lit review, right? It brings us back to the bit before the literature review. Someone contributed, how fixed are my research questions and objectives, and can I expect them to change? I think that's a good one.
It is. I mean, whether you can expect them to change, it's certainly fine for them to change. I think that's the nature of GT, is that what turns out to be important at the time or crucial to your kind of PhD, it may be that as you go down the kind of the route of data collection, data analysis, I think it's perfectly legitimate to be struck by something else which is more pressing or more interesting, or something which seems to be have greater kind of explanatory kind of power. I think it's perfectly fine to rephrase. And again, I think the process there is just to acknowledge, so to be kind of reflexive about when that change took place, when that direction took place, why it took place, what was that moment or that data or those participants that kind of really nudge you to explore something else. And then I think, the way I would do it would be to put a footnote in the thesis to say that, just to say how these research questions change and why they change, and you kind of write that in your reflexivity section. So it's absolutely fine, normal, good to notice things which you didn't otherwise know before you started.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly there'll be ethical issues if it turns out you want to completely deviate in terms of the methods of data collection or the sample, and then there's some ethical things to think about there and reapplication to RECT. But otherwise, I think to change your research questions in light of new knowledge, essentially new data, that's perfectly sensible.
Is there anyone in the very early stages where they're working on a proposal or is considering how to go about research questions? We had quite a few people come in, and we are pointing this to the very start. So is there anyone who is at the very start? I think someone posted something in the chat about very early on. I'm just trying to have a look who that was. That was Helen. Is Helen, where's Helen? Helen might have.
Yeah.
So
Sorry, just trying to work the controls. I'm more used to Teams, I think.
Helen, you said you're very right at the start of your doctoral journey. Yeah. So tell us a bit more.
So I started in September. I'm a lecturer at the University of Derby in mental health nursing. So I'm used to kind of the academic kind of life, but this is a step up in terms of my research kind of journey. And I'm looking at the impact that sports rounds have, which I don't know if people have heard of those. People that are in healthcare might have done, but it's they're interprofessional meetings, looking at supporting people with the emotional burden of caring. They're quite well established and well researched in kind of clinical practice existing organisations, but less so with student population. So there's some funding at the moment to roll it out within the East Midlands with students. So we've just started running them at the university. But what I really want to know at, so there's lots of research that talks about actually how it helps to support well-being of the people involved, but actually what impact does that have, and what's the process that then has in their clinical practice. So for students, how does that impact? So that's what I'm looking at. Obviously, I'm just doing lots of reading around methodologies, philosophy, all of that sort of thing at the moment. So this has been really timely for me.
Thank you very much. And
I have lots of questions, but not like anything specific, if you know what I mean. So
if it crops up, just shout. We have a few other people in the chat saying they're very early on. Which brings us to Oliver, in your own project, how did you settle on grounded theory?
I remember I think I remember the very moment. It was a meeting with my supervisor at the Russell Square Hotel in London, where she was based, and it was over a cup of tea. That was the moment I said to her, but I think really it was thinking about how I saw the research problem. You know, I was interested in decision making and clinical reasoning of clinicians, and so it was through. And so firstly, there are some just more superficial reasons as to why you choose GT. One is that my supervisors were into it. Two is that I'd kind of seen the name kind of flying around the literature and knew it was a kind of reasonably well used or frequently used methodology. But I think the Viva answer is something like how I conceptualize the research problem, in this case, decision making, to me wasn't something that was just objective thing that resided in one's head, but actually it was, as we said, a process of making sense. It was through clinical interaction. It was about collecting clinical information, interpreting that. So I guess that when you start to think about or talk about the research problem in those terms, it seems to it chooses itself, right? It kind of says, well, I'm not interested in power. I'm not really interested in lived experience. It's a doctoral program, so I've got to show probably, and this isn't being derogatory to thematic analysis, but perhaps something more explanatory than TA. And so I think that was probably how I came about choosing GT, was some kind of peripheral incentives in terms of supervisors and that kind of stuff, but also just how I thought about the research problem. You know, what am I interested in? How am I seeing this? And having that kind of superficial kind of glaze of the literature and seeing how it was discussed. So that was it. But I remember when I first kind of engaged with it, it was incredibly daunting. Even the name grounded theory isn't especially. It's kind of this big, scary thing with theory in it. It's kind of going to put you off, right? And so it wasn't a particularly what's the word? It didn't seem accessible just through its very label. But no, it was fine. But that was really how I thought about the research problem.
And following on from that, because you went constructivist route, didn't you? So how did that fit in?
That again, it fitted in because it made sense to me that there wasn't a good, as a doctoral student, there wasn't a good underpinning kind of epistemology. I couldn't defend the objectivist or Glazerian GT. And I went through some kind of postgraduate kind of modules on qualitative research, and they really kind of hammered home the kind of ontology and epistemological thinking and having kind of those foundations. And when you went to the classical stuff, it was empty. There was a kind of tacit assumptions around epistemology, but not enough as a student to think, oh, this is a safe, justifiable methodology. And I remember asking at the University of Brighton Grounded Theory interest group, we had Barney Glaser on Skype back in the days when you had Skype and when he was alive. And I asked him, I remember he was in one of the lecture theatres, he was huge, he was massive on this great big screen, big head of Barney Glaser. And we all he gave a little presentation and we got to ask questions a bit like this, just like this actually. But we were actually there, and I asked him, I said, I've got to write this in my thesis. Do you have any tips about what the sections around epistemology and ontology, what do I write? Knowing that he didn't really engage with any of that stuff. And he kind of mumbled something about, I don't know, constant comparison, I don't know what he said, but it wasn't particularly helpful. And so again, I think Nikki, I vived you, and you've got a much more thorough discussion of your positioning using Glazerian GT. But for me as a PhD student, it was both constructivist at the time. That's when kind of Shamaz was really developing those underpinning those epistemological principles, which seemed to make sense to me. Again, the idea of kind of constructing knowledge, constructing theory sat well with me as a clinician, and decision making and clinical reasoning. So it all fitted quite nicely together. It's all quite coherent.
Yeah. And I guess your dual identity as researcher and clinician probably had a feral thing to do with that, which I mean, there were a couple of people submitted something. There were a few questions that clustered around the same thing of but what about the researcher's own role in the research process? Because if you read Glaser's, particularly his earlier work, it's all about, well, the memoing and the constant comparison will sort that out for you.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, like I said before, it just didn't seem a kind of good answer, really, that it would all just come out in the wash. And maybe it did. I mean, in your case, it kind of did. That. But again, it would seem to me that it just doesn't make sense that when you're engaging with participants in an interview or an observation, I did both, and some video recording, to see me as a detached observer, and I could just kind of reach into some objective reality and fish out the important stuff, and not really think about, well, what role, why am I choosing this data, or what was it, why am I noticing this thing about this interaction? To not really have a good answer for that just didn't seem very intelligent or very kind of sophisticated. And I'm not saying it hasn't moved on from there, but so again, it just didn't seem feasible to me, and I needed to say something about this, how this would, the mechanics of this, and constructionism gives you some of that language to say, actually, it's participatory. You really are building this stuff together, and once you take that position, it's actually not hard at all to begin to locate yourself, to acknowledge your preconceived ideas, your bias. There's nothing wrong with that. There's no problem there. So again, it was about kind of, I guess, epistemological coherence. It just made more sense. I could tell a more meaningful story.
Yeah, and I guess that's what it's all about, isn't it? It needs a story, but it needs to be a meaningful one, because in the end, there's going to be an end user to your research, and they need to be able to pick it up and use it, and it needs to make sense to them as well as to you as a researcher. Audience, any other questions on the earlier stages of grounded theory? Where are you guys in the process? We had a few people. Oh, we have, who we got here? Oh, here we go. Let me just do a quick skim read. Please give. Here we go. This is a very interesting question, and it fits perfectly where we need to go. Please, could you provide some examples of good grounded theory research questions, perhaps from your own research? Do you remember the questions from your doctoral thesis?
I do, or something like I do. I think the primary research question was, what is the nature of clinical reasoning? I think amongst osteopaths, I think the word nature, I kind of thought about what I mean by nature. And I think nature, and I Googled it, and I kind of looked it up, this kind of, I wanted the explanatory kind of concepts which constitute clinical reasoning. So I think a good grounded theory research question needs to allude to that social process. I think that's what it is. It's like, obviously it's not looking to establish causation. You don't want a dichotomous answer, but something which really alludes to kind of the processual life, something like that. So how you phrase it, is clearly vary, but I think you can just kind of notice what a GT research question is from, say, a phenomenological research question or other one. So I think one that kind of nods to the kind of processual aspects of social life.
I mean, I think in my case, it was how do course leaders use evidence? So it's very much focused on the thing of doing and trying to.
Yeah.
If the answer to the question is an explanation, then you're kind of there, aren't you?
Yeah.
Because grounded theories, the point of that is to come up with an explanatory theory that explains what's going on for these participants. So it's something that ends in an explanation of the thing, starting with either how or something along those lines, tends to work quite well. If people are willing to, please feel free to share if you have already got a research question, please feel free to share them in your chat, as Maria's indicated. Thank you very much, Shanley, for being here and for doing this as professional development for your students, because that's a big thing. We're here most of us here are early career researchers, PhD students, PGRs. It's nice to see supervisors join us as well, who have it as an early part of their grounded theory journey, because it can be very daunting, because we are different. Grounded theorists are weird. At least I know I am. But we're a bit of an odd bunch, but that makes us much more fun. Have we got some people? We've got some quite a couple of questions in the chat at the moment who are all about active processes. How do people do it? What makes a successful manager? There's kind of like behavioral operational questions, aren't they? And
Yeah.
I think something along those lines will, if you keep it broad enough, because that's the second part of the thing, we'll make it a good grounded theory question.
Yeah, and clearly you'll have some kind of more focused secondary questions, but they should also have those similar characteristics where you're kind of nodding to that active process, but it just helps kind of focus one's mind and obviously the data collection. But I still see the research questions as malleable, really up until the point you submit your thesis. As long as you can document that, as long as you can really be clear that why it may have changed and how it may have changed and what was that moment, and you can kind of give it some consideration.
Any other questions from the audience? Anyone? I guess, can we briefly focus on credibility? Because there's something that seems to happen when you first tell people you want to use grounded theory. There's always an element of pushback around it surrounding rigor and credibility. So what is your take on ensuring that a grounded theory study is rigorous and credible?
Yeah, that is a good question. I think there's some things to think about. How do you know when you've got it? I think that's the other thing. How do you know when you've got the theory? And I'm not sure if you ever really know. I suppose firstly is just you can begin to make sense. We talked about telling a coherent story, but you can begin to make sense of the data. You can account for the variations in data too. You start to notice the explanatory kind of reach of your theory. So I think before you get to that, it's just thinking, well, how do I know when I've got it? And it's a very difficult time as a PhD student. You don't know. You're waiting to get this thing. You think it's going to be a moment. You wake up and you've just got it. But it's this kind of, and even when you think you've got, ultimately you're bound by deadlines and you have to get it right because you've got to submit a thesis. Otherwise, it's all been a waste of time. So you're forced to get it at some point. I think in terms of the credibility, I think the strategies which you can build into your study, which are kind of consistent across qual research, seem to fit quite well. Thinking about going back to participants to explore your theory with them as your theory is developing, is to maybe test some of those ideas with them. I think this idea to have conversations about where you're going with your analysis, whether or not there's kind of resonance and salience to them, given that they're the ones who are grounded in your theory or their data. Having conversations with peers, kind of peer debriefing, again, about theory development, those who maybe aren't part of the study, but are just kind of colleagues who are within that field or maybe outside that field, and just checking with them, having a conversation over a coffee, but logging that. I mean, it is an informal process, but you writing a memo after that coffee and after that discussion and seeing if they can offer analytical insights or to say that seems to resonate with my experience, or actually it's not like this at all, I see it like this. All of that helps gives you some kind of leverage on where you're going. So I think obviously engaging in the field, immersing yourself, those kind of good interview practices, having a good relationship with participants so they really do disclose all the interesting detail that you're looking for. So there are some strategies which I think some are, I think, just generic qual strategies. Others might be more kind of local to GT.
And I think that, and what you're saying kind of aligns with, I guess, most of the shall we say, big players in grounded theory, because they've all had some sort of version of their own quality criteria for a grounded theory, I guess. Because I mean, every one of the bigger books has something in along the lines of what a good grounded theory looks like. But it distilled down is that's what it comes down to, isn't it?
Yeah.
You might call it slightly differently, but so if you're in your early stages, go and have a look at the various textbooks and see what they describe as the criteria of a good grounded theory, and see where they overlap. Because although we've got different flavors of grounded theory, the endpoint is always going to be an explanatory theory. And therefore, if the endpoint is in principle similar, then the criteria for quality should be fairly similar. So go to the literature. It's there and it's good, although sometimes it can be a bit heavy. I think we probably have time for one more question before we start finishing up today. So if anyone has, does anyone have, here we go. Perfect time, Matilda. Do you have any advice on conducting grounded theory with several members of the same families? You might need to elaborate on that briefly, Matilda. What do you mean with several members of the same families?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. Is it the participants from the same families, or you've got your research team is from the same family, or you're talking about the family of grounded theory?
Oh wait, Matilda also put a research question. How do individuals with and family members adapt following the? Right. So you're looking at both individuals and their family members. Okay, so your participants are members of the same family. Does that affect how you do a grounded theory, Oliver?
I mean, I think the first thing that I just comes to mind is the ethical issues there. I just can't, how that works and whether or not they all know they're taking part, and what are the ethical kind of boundaries between you clearly not disclosing what one family member said to them. And so I do see that as being, I'm just trying to get my head, I see that as being something to notice, that, how does that work? And given that your questions, assuming you're interviewing, but whichever way, some of those things will be informed by previous interactions or previous interviews, I also wonder how that's going to work, that if they know that they're all taking part and you begin to change your research, your interview questions based on preceding interviews, I'm just curious to know how you'll guard against some of that anonymity or some of that confidentiality, that you'll be potentially framing questions which may have been important to your previous participants of that family, which may then elude the current participants to how they're, what's going on. So I'm not quite sure, actually. I'm not quite, so I guess that's the first thing. Otherwise, I haven't got any kind of grounded theory tips, I don't think. If anyone else has, Nikki or Maria, but nothing which really strikes me as being, apart from maybe the ethical kind of implications, I don't see anything unique to GT in that respect.
I can't see any from a methodological perspective, no, because in the end, I mean, it's all where the data takes you. And if you start with one and then the data takes you to the family members, then you go to the family members. Yeah. It's the operational part of doing research that I guess is the harder bit. But from a methodological perspective, I don't see the problem.
Yeah. And I guess it's just that data, whether it's individuals or I guess it's how you kind of package up that data. Is it a focus group with families? Is it individuals of the same family? So there might be a bit of kind of thinking about how you present the data and how it's portrayed as individuals or family participants.
Yeah. So possibly, Matilda, not a straightforward answer. But I guess that's part of the doing of the research. So hopefully that was somewhat helpful. Then I guess a very final one for me, because it's close to my heart, Ollie, as you will probably know. How do the reflexivity work from a grounded theory perspective?
Sorry, how do you do
reflexive practice within grounded theory?
I think it happens from day one. I think you acknowledge even where those research questions came from. I think that's it's really threaded through the entire process, that it's just about really making some kind of indelible marks around your thinking, your direction of analysis, the things which might be influencing that analysis. So for me, memowriting and reflexivity just go hand in hand, and you've got a really novel way of recording memos or audio memos, a really good way of doing that. But somehow just having some place to put your cognitions, your feelings, your thoughts, and being able to go back to those, knowing where you're standing in relation to grounded theory and in relation to your epistemology, just having an awareness of some of those assumptions, how they feed into your data analysis and data collection, and as we said, kind of even just the phrasing of the research problem. So it's just a kind of heightened sense of kind of metacognition, kind of awareness about who you are, why you're doing this, what's influencing you, how you're influencing your subsequent theory development, and just being really cognizant of that.
And then a sneaky final one. If you were to have 3 top tips for someone at the start of a grounded theory journey, what would those 3 top tips be?
Oh, 3 top tips. 3 top tips. 3 top tips. I think these isn't any, not in order, but I think stick with it. If you've decided to go to do it, to engage with it, or to utilize it, I think stick with it. I think like all qualitative research, it can just be a complete kind of quagmire of what there were some questions I think someone wrote on the chat, which is not knowing what you're looking at, and there's so many potential. I mean, there's just an infinite number of potential paths to take. I think that can be immensely daunting and paralyzing for people new to the methodology. Well, how do I know what's important? How do I know what analytical kind of leads to follow up on? There just seems to be an infinite number. So I think sticking with that, and I think that, and also just making some pragmatic decisions we talked about around, you've got to produce a thesis at the end of this whole, we're not here necessarily for fun, and we are here for fun, but ultimately there's an outcome which you need to get to. And I think whilst it's great to kind of really immerse oneself in the kind of interesting kind of sociological, methodological histories, you still have to make some practical decisions about where, when will you stop collecting and analyzing data? When can you sufficiently demonstrate your theory, and when is there a sufficient amount of data or quality data to support your theory? So I think one is just to stick with it, even though it can be really confusing and challenging. 2 is to make, eventually you have to make some decisions, whether you like it or not. And the 3rd one, I'm not sure, probably about, thinking when to, we spoke about at the beginning, when to go back to those early texts, and not in the beginning. I found it helpful reading the commentary around some of those early texts from Bryant or Shamaz, and then dipping into some of the early stuff.
Oh, we'll have another one.
Dipping into those early texts rather than starting, right, I'm going to do GT, let's start with time for dying, and then moving through from there, when it can just be, it can put you off essentially. So I think probably be a bit informed and then go back to the early texts.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for that, Oliver. It's always a pleasure to discuss these things with you. However, we only have an hour and we are nearly there. We would like to ask the participants in the audience, as we are working to planning ahead for future seminar sessions, Maria should have, with a click of a button, a final Menti where you could please, if you would, leave us some feedback about what you want future sessions to focus on. So there's a link in the chat at the moment. If you wouldn't mind just dropping us a line of feedback as to what kind of topics would you be interested in the next couple of meetings, because we've got the next 2.5, I guess, lined up. But what else? What can we do? What would you like to know? Where do you want us to steer this series of seminars to? And then whilst that's coming in, I think, did I see Pippa come back? Because I didn't see her nip out. Pippa, are you in a position for announcements, or would you like me to cover them?
Hi, Nikki. No, I'm still here. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, all good.
I was trying to update my Mentimeter at the same time, so I might just have to come back to that. I had 3 things I wanted to put in. Yep, so we've got some great plans ahead. Lovely to see so many people here today. So really good to get some things in your diary coming up. So our most recent events have all been online, so you'll be dead excited to hear that we have our first face-to-face session. That's going to be in Chelmsford in Essex, and that's on the 21st of November. And it's going to be all about creative methods in grounded theory. So moving away from the standard interviews that are so often used, but getting some excellent speakers in to really get our minds thinking about how we can use creative methods. And then we'll be back to online mid-February. We're probably looking somewhere like the 15th or 19th of February. We're yet to really pin down that date. So keep an eye out on your emails for a certain update on that. And we'll probably be thinking about the feedback that we get from this group as to how we shape that. But possibly as a follow-on from this session, it might be around something to do around the early phases of data collection. And then our last one that we've got booked for the year so far will be just before the summer on the 13th of June. And again, that will be influenced by the great feedback that you're giving us at the moment. So get those dates in your diary, and we look forward to seeing you there.
Yeah. So some exciting stuff looking ahead. So be on the lookout on the various socials. We will plaster it all over there. We will contact people directly where we feel it's appropriate, I guess, via the mailing list created through these seminars. There's a lot of stuff coming in, a couple of overlapping ones. So we will put a program of seminars together on the basis of the feedback we've got here. Should something come to mind at a later date, please.
It's so cool being in a chat where you totally understand what they're saying. It's so cool. It's freaking weird.
Abby, you are not muted.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right, but we appreciate the feedback. It's great.
Talking to my mum, sorry.
See, there is a mum on the call. I love it.
Yes.
Excellent. So we will put a program together, but if something does come to mind at a later date, please do feel free to let us know either via email or via the various socials. We are all contactable. That leads me to, it is bang on 3 o'clock. So once again, a very, very big thank you, Oliver, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. And that brings us to an end for today. And we look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye all. Bye-bye.